I'm going to start with a story because I study stories in comedy. So several years ago, a comedian that is a friend and a collaborator, a guy named Mamadou Njai, walked onto a sold-out packed house in a theater in Norfolk, Virginia called the Addicts Theater, and he delivered a joke that killed. For those of you that don't know that comedy parlance, that meant it was good. It was a good joke. And I'm not going to do the joke because I'm not a comedian, but I want to tell you the setup of the joke from Mamadou was, I'm going to tell you what's happening in these white people climate justice rooms. And he said, I want to tell you what they care about in those rooms. And he goes on, and the punchline of the joke, which is very funny and is completely Mamadou's creation, says that there's this priority list and includes things like polar bears and straws, and at the bottom of the list are people of color. Now I'm going to pause because that joke might make you uncomfortable, and I would ask you, is it the joke that should make us uncomfortable, or is it the fact that that joke killed in that room and that that was Mamadou's idea? There is a right answer to that question, but I'll move on. And the reason why I wanted to start with this story is to tell you that in that room in Norfolk, Virginia, in this particular community, that was not a group of people that needed any reminders about the climate injustice and racial injustice that have been happening in their community for hundreds of years. They did not need that reminder. But in a community that felt a kind of resilience fatigue, comedy turned out to be a way for people to play, a little bit of light, a little bit of hope and optimism. And perhaps what was welcome were ideas about new ways to engage and to find resilience and catharsis. And it turns out that comedy and play are pretty great ways to do that. We are predisposed to play and find some common ground through comedy. So this was a special called Ain't Your Mama's Heat Wave. My organization and I collaborated with the amazing Hip Hop Caucus to create this show together to really talk about the climate injustice happening, particularly in communities of color. This was a collaboration led by women and communities of color, our two organizations. And later on in the year, Hip Hop Caucus took elements of this show. It was an entirely black cast and crew, and they took this show and leveraged it to do voter engagement in the area around what was happening in the area and surrounding areas. So this is a story of several that I like to talk about in the books that I write and the work that I do. But let me tell you a little bit more about comedy. So this kind of project is part of the multiracial, co-created collaboration work that I and my team do at the Center for Media and Social Impact. And we really, really believe, we always say we're serial collaborators, and we really believe in the role of organizations that actually can come together. But why comedy? So I've been working in media and social justice my entire career, and there have been lots of different terms that have come and gone. I'm also a professor, so that's why I write the books. Oh, by the way, the stuff I'm going to tell you is peer-reviewed. Everybody relax. Because I'm about to tell you some studies, and you're going to want to know were they peer-reviewed. Yes. So why comedy? So in all of that work, it is, I actually started a research agenda about 10 years ago after producing comedy and other work in Hollywood for a while. I was very frustrated that I looked around at this sector of work that I care about so much, human rights and social justice writ large, and I kept saying, why are we leaving comedy on the table? Why are we not leveraging comedy? And so that led us to start a pretty dramatic research and creative agenda at CMSI, my organization, to actually set out to ask and answer, what is it about comedy that actually can be leveraged when we think about the world's most wicked problems, including climate change and environmental justice? So I want to give you a few highlights today. There are many, many about why comedy and why now, and I will start with a few quick studies, again, peer-reviewed. This is a study that I like to talk about a lot. So when it comes to comedy and behavior change and attitudes and intentions and all of that I know we're talking about for days here, Knowing more, this one should make us sad, and you probably already know it, knowing more does not necessarily propel us to more action, right? So in this study of a documentary that I produced with Hassan Minhaj, who you might recognize, this is also Umpo Paps and Aditi Mittal. Umpo is from South Africa, Aditi is from India. This was a project called Stand Up Planet, a sort of comedic documentary about the grotesque absurdity of global development and global poverty. So we examined audience responses to this comedic documentary compared to sort of the normal way that we usually encounter this kind of topic, sort of long form, somber documentary. And we found that the audience perhaps learned slightly more about the topics from the serious documentary, but that didn't have much to do with anything about what they felt or what they intended to do. That was the role of the comedy. And so in this case, feeling emotions of hope and optimism were actually the mediating factors that predicted the attitudes and the likely behavior change. So that was a pretty fun study. A second study, very briefly, we did a study at my organization where we looked at the differences between people watching a Samantha Bee treatment talking about the Syrian refugee crisis, which of course, one of the worst humanitarian crises of the century, and examined that against a news piece. It's worth mentioning that Samantha Bee did a lot of things in this video piece. It was actually very funny. She went to a refugee camp and she spent a lot of time with people. People on camera had a speaking agency. They were portrayed as real three-dimensional people. The news portrayal was sort of focusing on sheer numbers. And in this case, the entertainment value was also part of what contributed to why people cared more. The fact that they thought it was funny and entertaining, so actually the entertainment value, i.e. was it good, was actually really meaningful in whether or not people felt, shifting attitudes and intended behaviors. So let me step back a little bit. That's just a couple of studies, because I wanted to let you in on a little bit of how we would design that kind of work, because I know there are a lot of other fellow social scientists and other scientists in the room. Let me step back and tell you a little bit more. After 10 years of studying across disciplines, what is it that we can actually know about how comedy affects us as audiences when we experience civic, social, and public health issues through a humorous route? And here's the really fun part. Comedy is studied by almost every discipline. How cool is that, right? Psychology, sociology, my field, communication, media effects. It goes public health, on and on and on. So I really wanted to know, through a synthesis of others' work and my own original work, I really wanted to know what is it that we agree on across disciplines about how comedy behaves in this way. Okay, so here are, I'm not telling you 10 years of research, but I'll give you some quick highlights. Comedy is almost uniquely able to bring us into taboo topics that are hard to talk about. Mamadou had a pretty hard joke that was taboo, but it actually opened a lot of doors for discussion. Hope and optimism, as I've just shared with you, can be motivating emotions. We know that emotions like anger and rage are also motivating, so I'm not saying we're pitting it against, but why is it that we don't think about laugh and play and optimism as equally superpowers? That's a question for later. There is some evidence that when we encounter serious technocratic issues through comedy first, it serves a sort of translational role that we may follow up on that information more seriously over time. So I like to talk about that as a gateway. Comedy has a sleeper effect. We tend to remember things when we hear them through comedy. This is why Super Bowl ads are funny, because marketing people have known this for a long time. Persuasion via entertainment value and positive emotions, which we've talked about. Okay, so if we know, let's say you believe me, and I've said peer review 800 times, so presumably you would, what might it look like if we actually paired serious comedy people, professional comedy writers, producers, performers, with real climate scientists? Maybe there would be some great, funny comedy that would actually be message appropriate and factually accurate, and maybe would find new lenses into old problems that we've talked about for a while. Because one of the things I can tell you from working with comedians for a million years, one of the things that they're spectacularly good at is taking lots of input and lots of information and spitting out a way to think about it that you never thought of. That's why they're funny. So this provocation led my organization and Generation 180 to create something that we love called the Climate Comedy Cohort. The Climate Comedy Cohort really pairs professional comedy people at the highest level of their professional work with climate scientists to actually co-create very funny comedy together, and for that comedy to land in lots of different places, from the shows and stand-up shows and the work of the comedians themselves who now have absorbed the climate science and are finding new ways into it. And I like to imagine that the climate scientists walk away embracing their own entertainment value and perhaps desire to be funny and entertaining. That's not for everyone, but just in case it inspires one climate scientist to be funny, I think that's great. And so I want to leave you with this. This is one of my favorite things to say about comedy. Comedy and social justice live together because social justice requires that we find a new way to see something that we thought we had a handle on, and we thought we saw the only 6 ways of seeing it. Because comedy finds the incongruence of a situation, it sets up something, and we believe this is how it is. And the incongruity, the bend of the reality, is actually what makes us laugh. And so when we think about comedy, and we think about the kinds of issues that everyone in this room is dealing with, and that we as a globe are going to have to figure out, we might want to really consider inviting comedy in and not quite being so afraid of it as a way to help us find ways to find real common ground with each other, to wrestle with uncomfortable and taboo truths, and to really play together. Thank you so much for your time.